we were surprised to find that our predicted value for the maximum body size.
Nah, still not quite working.
Something our overlords do not want us to hear.
Yeah, the NSA really is cutting us out. There's a picture here.
Keys to evolution are not meant for public consumption.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
To Science Sort of. This is episode 279. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science, it's Patrick Wheatley.
Hey, I'm back.
You're back. And from the background noise, you might not guess it, but we are also joined by our original third PaleoPOW, Justin Yeakel.
All back to 2009.
He's on location.
Yeah, he's on location searching for the world's largest mammal.
Thought he was the world's largest mammal.
Oh, well, yeah, Yetis might be the world's largest mammal, and that's what he's on location to find out for sure. Welcome back, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Good to be back.
This is a bit of an interesting scenario. Last week, I had my largest interview to date, total of 5 people on the call, myself included, and this week we're doing something a little different again, because Justin is on the move.
I am traveling. I am at 73 miles per hour on 152, heading...
Don't implicate yourself, Justin.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, right.
You are using all legally required hands-free devices, but because of scheduling, this was the best time for us to chat. And you have a new paper out, and so we wanted to chat about that. Oh, no.
I do.
I left my copy of the paper. I'm going to reach for it. Keep talking.
Yeah, so we had a paper come out in Nature Communications last week, I think. You might have to tell me the title.
Okay. The title is The Dynamics of Starvation and Recovery Predict Extinction Risk and both Demuth's Law and Cope's Rule. Demuth's Law?
Yeah. Demuth's Law. Yeah, so the title is kind of a funny story because Nature Communications does not allow any punctuation in the title. So
Cope's Rule?
No colons, no commas. So we had to come up with some strange wording to get that all in there without any punctuation.
But they allow apostrophes.
Yeah.
They do allow apostrophes, yes. I guess, I guess that's punctuation. It's kind of punctuation.
Don't they know that commas look just like that?
I know. You wouldn't think that there would be a problem. Just move it down a little.
Yeah.
Can we subscript the comma or subscript the apostrophe?
Are they still using block print type that they have to lay it out to get it in the journal? Come on.
It's hand drawn. All of the letters are hand drawn.
So tell us the story of this paper.
So essentially, we came up with this pretty simple model based on Lotka-Volterra predator-prey dynamics, and the whole idea behind that is you have a predator population and a prey population, or more generally, a consumer population and a resource population. And as the resource increases in number, so do the consumers, because the consumers are growing. Consumer population is growing as a function of the resource density. So we put a little tiny twist into that and imagined 2 states that the consumer could be in, a full state and a hungry state. So it kind of operated like a switch. So if you're starving, you switch from the full state to the hungry state. And when you recover, you build back your biomass, you build back your resources, your onboard resources. Then you move from the hungry state to the full state. The rule that we employed was that you can only reproduce when you're in the full state, and you only die when you're in the starved state. So we essentially only included death from starvation.
Okay, so you can't get eaten.
Yeah, there's no higher trophic level than the consumer and resource. They exist in isolation, which is an important caveat. And, it's kind of based on the idea that if you're starving, you're not looking to reproduce, you're busy trying to survive. And when you're full, then you're capable of, your reproduction engine turns on and you can do your business.
So can you run us through what Demuth's Law is and what Cope's Law is?
I knew Cope's going into this, but I didn't know Demuth's.
I'm in the same boat, but we should clue everyone in.
Right. So Davis law is an obvious observation when you think about it, that there's lots of individuals for, smaller sized organisms have larger populations and larger organisms have smaller populations. In other words, there's lots of mice, but not that many elephants.
Well, Justin, there's a very good reason there's not that many elephants, and I don't think it's strictly based on their size. It's because they're delicious.
They're delicious. That's right. So, and the relationship between population size and body mass follows a scaling law. In log space, it's a straight line with a very particular slope of about 3/4 or minus 3/4. So that relationship is Davis law. And so, and then Cope's rule is an macroevolutionary trend for lineages over long periods of time to increase in body size. So generally, and this only exists at a macro level. So you look in any specific lineage, or you look at too small of a chunk of time, this doesn't generally hold. But in general, over evolutionary time, there's a tendency for organisms to get bigger.
Right, and this is one of those rules that's constantly being tested against different population sets or different data sets, and it's one of those that sometimes holds up and doesn't always hold up, and the mechanism isn't really clear. Like, why would things tend to get bigger over time? Like, it's not as if resources increase linearly over time. Resources are probably mostly stable, and so why would this happen?
I thought, well, you could...
Right, so... Yeah.
I'll give an example real quick. If you think of like early horses, they were sort of teeny tiny, like dog-sized things, like small dog-sized things. And now you could ride around on one.
Well, with proper training.
Exactly.
Patrick, and equipment.
Well, so that's an example of a lineage that seems to be following Cope's rule.
Right. So we thought, we would investigate these things taking into account starvation dynamics. So individuals follow growth trajectories and over the course of their lifetimes. And so there's time scales associated with adding biomass onto your body and losing biomass when you starve. And because these control indirectly the reproduction and mortality of individuals within populations, because they determine the speed at which individuals switch between starved and full states in our model, we could incorporate these time scales. And when we did that, we were able to reconstruct Davis law essentially only by considering the timescales at which organisms switch between these two bins based on how quickly they can gain and lose body fat. And the other observation that we were able to make that we didn't really anticipate was that we were able to essentially provide a mechanism for Cope's rule. The way that we did that was by looking at the competitive advantage of similarly sized populations of competitors. So if you imagine two populations of competitors, each trying to go for a single resource, they're not interbreeding, but we could imagine that they're closely related evolutionarily. If one competitor has a little bit more fat on its body and one competitor has a little bit less, we can ask the question, does that competitor that has a little bit more fat have a competitive advantage? And if it does, then we would say that there might be a trend towards larger body size by being able to carry more fat on your body. And according to our model, that's true up to a certain point, and then it becomes better to be a little leaner. And that point where you switch from fatter having a competitive advantage to leaner individuals having a competitive advantage is exactly the maximum body size observed for terrestrial mammals in the fossil record, which is about 1.74 times 10 to the 7th grams, or 2.5 elephants. That's the size of Ventricutherium or Dinotherium.
Which are pretty much the largest terrestrial mammals that there have ever been, right?
Correct, yeah. So we would say when you just take starvation dynamics into account and nothing else, then you're going to have a steady push over evolutionary time towards larger and larger body sizes up until that point. And at that point, it's no longer profitable energetically to be any larger than that based on the metabolic rates and efficiencies of that we observe in mammals. Now, obviously, that's rare to get to that state, right? There's not that many animals in the fossil record or today that are that size. And that's because there's a lot of other things that are involved ecologically that put constraints on size, like predation, like, resource heterogeneity. But those kinds of things aren't in our model.
Well, it does seem like you can outgrow predation. Like, it is possible to become big enough that predators won't really mess with you, adult elephants, adult giraffes, things like that. And for animals like Indricotherium, which is this giant, rhino-like animal, it's in the rhino order Perissodactyla, I was always taught, and your paper doesn't necessarily contradict this, but it kind of gives more to the story, that one of the limits on getting that big is that it takes a really long time to be pregnant and gestate a baby.
Yeah.
And so for elephants, they have these really long gestation periods. It's like 18 months or something like that. And the longer it takes you to produce a new generation, the more susceptible you are to disruptions in your environment, in your population size, and the more likely your population is to collapse because of that.
Exactly. So there's a time scale that dictates every rate in our model. And one of those rates is the reproductive rate, the time that it takes to reproduce. And those time scales are allometrically derived. In other words, they're functions of body mass. And of course, we're just taking the average trend. So this is very much a model for the average mammal. It wouldn't necessarily work very well considering any specific scenario because it's an average trend and we're ignoring a lot of variability around that trend. But that's one of the relationships that's built in as a function of that allometry, is that as you get larger, the time scale or the time required to reproduce also gets longer.
If you hear some background noise on my end, listeners, it's because I actually printed out this paper and went through it with an old-fashioned pen and highlighter. Because I knew if I had it on my screen, all the equations and stuff, I might glaze over and go to YouTube. So I had to make sure I really put in the time. I did.
And if you hear background noise on my side, it's because I am driving.
And you talk about the average mammal. Can you define what that means in your head, or what you meant in the context of the paper?
Sure.
Is it a sphere with hair on it, Justin?
It's a sphere. It's a furry sphere with a placenta.
So no marsupials. No marsupials need apply.
No marsupials need apply. No aquatic mammals need apply either. We didn't include rates for aquatic animals, but it would be really cool to look at.
Well, most of these studies,
yeah,
I find that most of these studies that kind of generalize mammalia tend to have a terrestrial non-volant, so living on the ground, not flying,
non-swimming, non-digging.
Well, that was my thing is, I read papers like this, and every once in a while, I read a sentence and it'll say like, typically mammals do this. And I think in my head, well, not sloths. And so, I guess
probably not mole rats.
Sloths aren't, not our mascot, the naked mole rat. But they're a superorganism anyway, so they don't even really count.
Yeah, so the average mammal, as it's defined in this paper, is, okay, let's say we take the rate of starvation. And so this is essentially the rate at which you burn your fat. And that changes as a function of body size, because larger organisms can hold disproportionately more fat on their bodies than smaller organisms. So if you starve an elephant for a day, it'll be fine. If you starve a mouse for a day, it's going to be a lot closer to that starvation threshold. So the rate at which an organism starves changes with body mass. And so just imagine, in log space, a straight line with a lot of data points around it. And those data points are individual mammals. Those are measurements for individual mammals, mammalian species. And we're just drawing a line through that cloud of points. And so that's our average mammal. It's very much ignoring the variability around that line, some of which is substantial. And that's often the really interesting stuff. Those are the sloths, the mole rats, the weird animals that we all like to study. Those are the animals that attract a lot of us to biology. And those are the animals that we're ignoring because they're not average.
I actually would love to have a conversation with you off air about figuring out a way to do a follow-up to this, thinking about animals like sloths, because, I'm reading everything you're writing and it's all about like fat stores and food limitations. And you've got an animal like sloths who have, approaching 0% body fat and live in an environment surrounded by food. So it's,
The other thing we should I think it would be fun to think about, and probably lots of people listening would think this is interesting as well, is thinking about Homo erectus, floresiensis, Neanderthal, and Homo sapiens, like that sort of that competition. Do you think we just store more fat than everybody else? That's why we made it? Doesn't have anything to do with how smart we are?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of room for exploring the variability, animals that fall way off that trend line. I'm kind of new to the world of allometry. There's, people who do this. That's all they do. The theory of allometry, scaling relationships in biology. And I think the next big thing in that world is not explaining the trends, but the variability around the trends. What drives that variability? What organisms would you expect to fall far from the line, and can you predict it based on, say, their environment or their competitive pressures? That's where the cool stuff really is, in my opinion.
Oh, so that's cool. So you're saying build a model and then figure out which animals break your model, and then see if you can tweak the model to then incorporate the animals that fell outside the model the first time?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in terms of understanding why some animals are way off the trend, and what direction are they off the trend. Sometimes it's orders of magnitude off the trend. It's really strange stuff. And are there certain properties that are generalizable about their environments, their habitats, the challenges that they have to overcome, that drives you away from the trend? And I think that's where a lot of interesting questions lay, I think.
In your case, those would be animals that would be relatively large and still have really large populations, or small and have small populations?
Yeah, I mean, because all of the rates in the model are allometric, it could be, animals that are large but have very low amounts of body fat, or way more body fat than you'd expect. So that kind of falls in line with what you were just describing with, in the Homo lineage. People are really weird. We fall way off the trend in a lot of ways. Our brains are way larger than they should be. We store way more fat on our bodies than the rest of the great apes. And any lineage by itself is kind of weird.
You should love this, Ryan. This means we didn't have to go through an aquatic phase to have subcutaneous fat. We just needed to maximize our allometric relationships with.
Well, there you go.
Justin's model.
Do people still argue about that? Is that a thing?
I mean, people, not really. Us. We've dealt with it on the show pretty definitively.
The aquatic ape.
Yeah.
Not a thing.
It just requires a lot of extra steps there.
It sure does. Steps you could get by running. Literal steps. Your Fitbit would tell you that most of those adaptations for aquaticism also work for being a good runner. And when it comes to the apes, we are the runningest of all the apes.
Tell me why cheetahs have hair then, Ryan.
Nobody knows. It's an open question. Justin needs to incorporate it into his model.
Hey, speaking of models, you guys owe me a t-shirt.
Patrick's got him in the basement.
I believe I took my name off the ledger there. So, and in return, I was going to get a new t-shirt.
Yeah, just follow Patrick into his basement. I'll walk behind you.
Yeah.
It'll be fine.
Are they t-shirts with the new logo, or do you still have t-shirts with the old logo?
They're t-shirts with an intermediate logo. Yeah.
We're trying to hit a Patreon goal to make new t-shirts.
They tend to run a little small. I'll send you the biggest one we have.
Okay.
The biggest one, aka the ideal mammal size, is what we call that, the biggest one.
Right.
It better be as large as 2.5 elephants.
Maybe one of your kids can wear it.
So you got a little bit of press for this.
Yeah, you got
paper.
quite a bit of press, actually.
Well, let's not let it go to his head. And it seemed a lot of the headlines were centered around this idea that you were saying that the ideal mammal is bigger than elephants.
I mean, I think that's true.
Well, yeah, we can think that's true, but I'm wondering if Justin felt that was an accurate representation of the conclusions of the paper.
Well, I mean, it's a headline, right? So I don't think we ever use the word ideal. It's ideal or optimal.
Right, like as you've already said, the ideal mammal is a sphere with hair and a placenta.
Yeah,
right.
Just in terms of
3
what
kilograms.
we put into the model, right? So like it's optimal when you just take starvation dynamics into account without anything else.
But isn't it optimal but also unstable? Like, isn't that kind of what we were talking about earlier? Is that like once you reach that point, there's an instability?
No, it's actually stable. I mean, if you think of it as an attractor, if you're small, you get pushed to large, and if you're too large, you get pushed to small. So it kind of meets in the middle at a stable point.
The middle just happens to be 2.5 times larger than an elephant.
Yeah, but it's, you can imagine there's a lot of other things that push you around to find different optima that we just didn't include in the model. So, the fact that
you need a lot of food.
There's predation pressure when you're smaller, but if you're small enough, then you can hide. And if you're larger, the predation pressure gets really, you know what I mean? So,
well, and you referenced his work, but like this is something that Jim Brown has talked about a lot in his macroecology work, especially in relation to like island dynamics. There does seem to be a much easier to measure optimal island-sized mammal.
Well, for example, we don't include space. Space is not in our model.
The space that the animal lives in, you mean?
Correct. So the model is
space agnostic. Doesn't believe. Not sure if space exists.
It's space agnostic. It's a mean field model, so we don't take that into account. It assumes that a consumer anywhere can reach a resource that's anywhere, but of course, we know that consumers move over space and that resources are heterogeneous over space, and we also know that resources are confined to space, which is sometimes limited, like it is on islands. So I think if you add some of those elements into it, you would expect to get different optima, and that's one of the next things that we want to explore. For example, if we imagine the system on an island where space is limited, would that optima go down, which it often does. You often find that organisms have smaller body masses on islands, especially herbivores. So, and Brown has investigated a lot of those other constraints, and so I think you can get different optima based on the constraints that you put into it.
Well, the reason I brought that up, because I remember reading about this in his macroecology book, just called Macroecology. It's available in our Amazon store. And you do also see island gigantism. So one of the things he talks about in his book is sort of what you were talking about with there being this attractor where if you're too small, you grow bigger, and if you're too big, you grow smaller. And I remember learning about that in these island dynamics where if a mammal shows up that's really small, sometimes they get a lot bigger on an island instead of smaller. So obviously if a mammoth or a ground sloth ends up on an island, they tend to get smaller because on an island you're often resource limited, but also released from predators because of this. It actually goes back to Demuth's law that if there are fewer predators and more prey in the environment, then the odds of prey reaching an island before the predator reaches the island is higher. That makes sense?
Right.
And so you're less likely to have predators, but you're also less likely to have food. And so the pressure to get smaller is great. But if you are a tiny little thing and there are no predators, then you can, and there's less competition because you're one of the early arrivers to the island, you can get bigger. So we see it go both directions on islands towards this optima, toward this attractor point that you were kind of talking about that exists on an entirely different scale when you ignore the space constraints of an island.
Yeah, and you're going to have different attractors for animals that have different constraints. So, varanid lizards might have one optima, whereas mammoths would have another, which might explain why we get pygmy mammoths in the Wrangell Islands and Komodo dragons on the Komodo Islands.
So I want to ask a little bit about how you actually come up with this stuff, like how you come up with the model in the first place. Like, is it literally just sitting around a whiteboard trying to write out equations? Do you think about actual animals at all when you're doing this, or like what's kind of the interface of the study design and the development of the model?
Have you seen a mammal, Justin? Do you know what
when was the last time you looked in the mirror?
Certainly no mammals were hurt in the design and implementation of this project.
I had to get to one of the it's the second to last paragraph before you actually mention a single mammal in this seminal mammal paper.
I mentioned the Dinotherium and the
that is the second to last paragraph
earlier. I think it pops up earlier.
All
maybe.
Right. I did also staple the pages out of order, and that's not a joke. So
there were like 27 drafts to this paper, so I have no idea. I don't even know what the final version looks like. No, I'm just kidding. So,
not kidding.
This project was very much, whiteboard inspired. So it initially began with Sid Redner and I at Santa Fe Institute just kind of sitting down at a whiteboard and drawing things out. We built a dynamic model. Basically, the only desire was to explore how starvation affected dynamics. There was no direction towards trying to predict the things that are in the paper. Pretty soon after we sat down and sketched out the initial model, Chris Kempes came on board and really supplied the allometric perspective and, helped us all try to figure out how to incorporate these physiological rates that really connect the model to reality and allow us to actually compare to data. And, the whole Damuth's law and Cope's rule prediction that we were able to pull out of the model was really an after effect. It didn't come about until after we constructed the model itself. And then we were kind of surprised to see that it did what it did.
So when you got the optimum mammal size that's 2.5 times the size of an elephant, and you found that there was like fossil evidence for a mammal that size, were you done? You were like, we were right. We're done here. Mic drop. Is that how it went?
So I may cut out, guys, because I'm heading up over the pass now. So once we had the model together and we had the timescales in there, we were able to predict absolute barriers to size that make no sense whatsoever, which is kind of fun. So because we have an allometric scaling for the proportion of body fat that an organism can hold, we can ask the equations, well, how big would an organism be that is 100% fat? Which is like, I can't remember, it was like 120 elephants. So according to the scaling laws, if you're 100% fat, it's, you're getting into whale territory. Well, that's way above whale territory, but 100% fat and muscle is not too far away from blue whales.
Yeah, it's pretty
which
awesome.
They kind of are. I mean, there's definitely bones in there too, but you can ask those questions, like how big would an organism be if it's 100% fat, 100% fat and muscle? And so we were just kind of playing around with absolute constraints based on the allometric relationships. And then we thought, okay, well, let's see if we could explore Cope's rule a little bit, but we have to have we have to have some kind of selective mechanism in there to try to get to a mechanistic understanding of Cope's rule. And so then we incorporated this idea of competition between two similarly sized organisms to see, well, when does one win out over the other? And is there a transition when the lighter one or the fatter one wins out? And it just so happened that transition point was exactly at the observed body size for mammals in the fossil record. And it was a really surprisingly accurate result that we had to triple check just to make sure we didn't build in a loop in there somewhere. But it really was based on just those physiological.
Oop, you cut out a little bit. Can you say something about just those physiological something or other?
So we were surprised to find that our predicted value was so close to the observed value of maximum body size in the fossil record for mammals, terrestrial mammals, because it was really the only input to the model was the physiological rate. So we initially thought there might have been some circularity in there. We might have built in a loop by accident, but yeah.
Oh no!
No. Did I cut out again?
Yeah, pretty bad.
I can still hear you guys okay.
Yeah. Okay, Patrick and I will just perform the rest of the show for you.
Yeah, should we just talk about the paper without him?
I mean, I did read it as carefully and tried to get as much out of it as I could, given that
I like this paper.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course you do.
What does that mean?
Am I recording? Am I recording my insults to you? Oh, phew, I am. I don't know. I feel like
I like the kind of like quasi math.
Yeah, you like the quasi math, very abstract. Is that an unfair observation?
No, I just sometimes forget that everybody doesn't like it, I guess.
To you, it's just
Or
like
that you and
odd
I
to
don't
me.
like exactly the same things, yeah, when it comes to science.
Yeah, I want to go out and measure something. That's my kind of science. I'm getting my hands dirty in collections with Crocs for you.
That's awesome. I kind of like it though when you just like code something up and you're like, look, these other people measured some stuff and
This matches what they measured.
they didn't even need to do that. You can just sit here and
Yeah, but you wouldn't know your model was correct unless we measured it.
no, you're right. You wouldn't.
But you don't. Ugh.
I don't what?
Ugh. Just wait for the mediator to get back in here.
Justin Yeakel is.
Yeti mediator.
Justin Yeakel disappeared from a call while on Pacheco Pass.
Oh no!
Now
This is
now
evidence.
he terrorizes hikers. Justin Yeakel is the Yeti.
Oh, I thought this was going to be evidence against us in his murder trial. Like we killed him.
No, he roams the wilds of Pacheco Pass, terrorizing motorists.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Hey, Justin.
So I'm over the pass. There's still a few like little hills to go around. You guys have been on 152, right? Over Pacheco.
Oh yeah, it's a great road.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So it is not straight though.
The old Pacheco Pass.
Yeah, if you guys
Still interested in your paper?
Yeah.
Not really, no.
I was just teasing Patrick for his distaste for measurements.
Oh. I didn't hear the first part though.
Well, you'll have to listen to the episode.
How much longer you got in your drive? What are we looking at timing wise here?
About 15 minutes.
I think we can wrap it up in about 15 minutes, and then you can record your from
I think we
home.
can do it faster if we could just get through the part where you tell us whatever it is we're not supposed to hear.
I think we could do it right now.
All right, go for it. What was the surprising thing you found, Justin?
Yes, the surprising thing we found was that the predicted mass, I don't even remember what I was talking about. The predicted mass for the largest mammalian body size was pretty much spot on compared to the observed size, the body mass predicted from the fossil record. I don't know, I said it better the last 4 times, but...
Well, you would think with practice, you would have...
No, that's not how it works. So essentially, in the fossil record, we find the largest body size observed for terrestrial mammals is about 1.74 times 10 to the 7th grams. And this is estimated, so, there's some plus or minus attached to that. Some variability around that, some uncertainty. And based on the...
I think it just can't handle him talking for long stretches.
Apparently.
Wraps out on us.
Yeah.
Man, you're gonna have to go back to Merced. You're gonna have to go back to Merced, Justin. We just can't hear you over there.
I think your phone is still trying to connect to the tower in Merced. It hasn't updated. Will?
Yep. Then I found $20.
Wow, old joke.
Hey, guys.
Hey.
Justin!
How's it going?
Not bad.
Are we on the next episode?
Yeah, we're recording 280 now. No, we were gonna since you've been struggling with this for a while and we don't want to eat up too much of your phone's data, I was gonna ask a few wrap-up questions if that's all right with you, and then we'll let you go.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's cross our fingers.
Okay. So if you had to kind of sum up your paper in sort of one take-home message that you wanted people to get from reading it, what do you think that would kind of be?
The rate of starvation and recovery has a large impact on the dynamics of mammalian populations.
I like it.
That didn't say anything about body size.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's kind of why I wanted to give him a chance to say something that wasn't the headline for some of the pop press out there.
All right.
That's right. Well, because it's all dictated by body size, it has an impact on body size constraints as well. So I think, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because starvation and recovery, that's basically your body storing energy to facilitate every function that it does and losing energy doing things. And so those should be, essential
Parameters,
constraints that dictate the evolutionary trajectory of organisms as well as the ecological dynamics of their populations.
I buy it.
Yeah. You guys in?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
Yeah.
We'll need some follow-ups to look at things like sloths.
You can just write me in on the byline there. That's fine.
Okay, sounds good. Taking orders.
And then in addition to the work you're doing like this, Justin, is there anything else going on? Do you have any other projects that people can follow along online or in the real world even? Or what else is happening in the world of the Yeti?
Well, we've got another paper coming out here probably in the next couple weeks, I think. It's in philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. So these are special volume, or every volume of the journal pays tribute to a certain topic. So they're topical volumes. And this one is on straying in salmon. So salmon often, certain salmon species home into their natal stream to return from the ocean, reproduce. But there's often a substantial portion that strays into the wrong site. So this entire volume is on that subject of straying and what that might mean for the conservation and ecology of the populations. And our contribution focuses on an eco-evolutionary dynamic model where we incorporate both the population dynamics of salmon as well as the spatial dispersal of salmon from one site to another. In addition to that, we also include the evolution of traits that control how the population grows and to what extent it's optimized to one spatial habitat or another. So another really theoretical paper and has nothing to do with this one.
Cool. You'll have to find another time to commute and come back on.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, I'll be
Maybe we can
commuting
catch you
a
in the
lot,
morning.
Can we catch you in the morning?
Yeah, actually, I commute in, let's see, I'm on the road between 5:30 and 7, so.
Well, I guess one thing we didn't tell people at the beginning of this, because we just introduced you as the former host of the show, but we forgot to mention that you are now professor at the University of California at Merced.
I am. That is where I'm commuting from.
Do you need any grad students? How you doing on grad students?
Yeah, always looking for grad students. I've got a relatively small lab. There's 2 postdocs, 1.5 grad students, one grad student I'm sharing with physics, maybe another in the fall. I'm not sure, but yeah, I don't know how people have labs a whole lot bigger than that because I can barely keep track of what people are doing now. I don't know how Paul did it. Paul Koch or Patrick, all of our former advisor, and some extent or another.
He was my undergrad advisor.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how he kept track of everybody's projects, but I'm pretty much at my limits.
Yeah, it's hard to. Yeah, there's so much reading that goes into every paper, right, or every chapter of a thesis. It's hard to stay up on all the background and literature.
I have a lot of sympathy because you'd go into a meeting back in the day. You're a PhD student, you're an undergrad or whatever. You go into a meeting and you have to re-explain your project from the ground up every single time, and I have a lot more sympathy for why that's necessary now. It's like, okay, what were we talking about the last time that we met 2 weeks ago? When I've had like 10, 15 meetings in between then and now, and I have no idea where you're at. So
it is pretty demoralizing when you have to explain your project every time.
Right. Okay. It's like, yeah, we covered this last time. And it's like, you're going to have to help me. You're going to have to help me. And let's just hope that we push the ball forward this time.
It's like Sisyphus kind of thing.
It really is. It really is. I have a lot more sympathy for that now.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. If you thought this paper discussion was super fascinating and you were really excited by the research, don't bother. The lab is full.
Except for the entire middle part that is apparently censored.
Yeah, I'm just going to insert a beep, just like the censor beep for the entire length of the time you were cutting out.
This project was funded by DARPA, and we're not allowed to talk about it.
Well, I realize you're on your phone, and so you might not have access to all of your links, but does your lab have a website? Is there a place people can go online to see more of the work you're doing? This paper in particular, I will mention, was open access, right?
This was open access. It only cost $5,200. So you could buy open access for this journal or a car.
Justin paid for this, so you could go read it. Don't let his dollars go to waste.
Yeah, don't sleep on this, people.
Yeah, so our website is Yeakel, JDYEAKEL.github.io, and that's it.
I went on a GitHub rant on a recent show, and I got some feedback about that. So we might need to have you back on to defend GitHub.
Oh wow! So a rant against?
It was anti.
Is that correct?
Just
You can't even imagine.
It's not
it's GitHub.
I don't. Why? It doesn't even make any sense.
I know it doesn't make any sense. That's why I don't like it.
That was basically the rant in a nutshell right there. This makes no sense. And every time I try to type Git, I spell it with an E.
Oh man.
And they can follow you on Twitter at JD Yeakel.
Hey Ryan, I might have to get pushed back. Hey.
Is that a joke? About
yeah. Because you get pushed, you get pull.
Well, I'm on your GitHub page right now. I'm going to go ahead and report this user, get them blocked.
I'm going to go ahead and clone that up.
I was really pleased with myself too. I thought that was a good pun.
Well, write in if you thought it was a good pun, folks. PaleoPOWs at ScienceOrb.com or the contact page on our website.
Man, this has really gone downhill.
Yeah, it's almost like 1/3 of us just stopped caring about the audio quality at all.
This is like our first episode. This is why I stopped doing it in the first place.
That is not true. That is not. We know that's not true.
Audio problems. At least I'm not editing.
I was going to say that's why you quit. Is because I used to make you jokers edit.
Right, exactly. That was a lot of work.
Yeah. Somehow it's only more work now because I try.
Right. Like I could do this or my PhD.
Well, I also have like better audio editing skills, and so I try to flex those muscles because if I can produce a better product, I want to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it takes you less time than it used to take me.
Quite possibly, but yet I don't know that the improvement in overall quality is substantial enough to warrant the increased time. Why don't you write a model about that? I don't know why it suddenly gotten defensive and aggressive in here, but.
Seriously, GitHub editing.
It's a garbage program. Come at me, GitHub.
They might sponsor you. You gotta actually might sponsor you after this show because I'm on.
They can sponsor me to stop saying negative things about them.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't very impressed with my drive out here.
Well, I think it sounds like you're somewhere.
Close to home.
Yeah. I'm entering Gilroy now.
Can you smell the garlic?
Yeah. Well, that's more in the spring, early summer.
Well, I think we can go ahead and let you go then, but I'll be sure to link to the paper in Nature Communications as well as the motherboard article was the Pop Press article I was going to link to just because I know those guys and I like them, and I'll link to your lab webpage and your Twitter account, and that way people can follow along with all the fun, and maybe you'll come back in a few weeks and talk to us about salmon.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
People can.
Well, thanks for having me on, guys. Good to
fork your repository.
Yeah, it was Patrick's idea.
Hey, good talking to you guys again. Miss your voices.
Good talking to you, man.
we do a podcast. You can listen to us.
Yeah, that's right.
You're the one we never get to hear from.
Oh, that's still free? That's
not for you. I wrote a Git script.
We pay for that open access, Justin.
Open access is not cheap.
All right, well, thanks for risking the drive with us, and we're glad you made it to your destination safely, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right, take care, guys.
Bye, buddy.
I'll send you a clip of me opening a beer.
Nice. Yes, we're going to drop that in the next segment. That's going to be great.
Okay, perfect.
Bye.
All right, see ya. Bye.
All right. Drinks?
Yeah.
I need one.
Well, no, come on. We can do better than that.
Oh,
Well, thanks again to Justin for giving us some of his time. And even though he's no longer with us, we suspect that somehow he will find a way to join us in our next segment. And that segment is, What Are We Drinking?
No matter where you go, you know you're not alone. I'm only one call away. I'll be there to save the day. Superman got nothing on me. I'm only one call away. And when you're weak, I'll be strong. I'm gonna keep holding on. Now don't you worry, it won't be long, darling. And when you feel like hope is gone, just run into my arms. I'm only one call away. I'll be there to save the day. Superman got nothing on me. I'm only one. I'm only one call.
Well, it would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. Justin, of course, was driving during the first segment, so it would be irresponsible for him to be drinking anything other than crisp, refreshing water, which California is out of, so he wasn't having any of that. But he may or may not have had something when he got home and said he would send me a clip of him enjoying it. So we're going to start off with our guest and whatever clip he sent me to use right here.
Okay, guys, I am home. I've got a Anchor Brewing Go West IPA, India Pale Ale. Yeah, okay, here it goes. It's cold. It's good. That's what I'm drinking.
Oh, wasn't that delightful, Patrick?
Yeah, it's a little hard to know what to say after that.
Well, you know, Justin's an unpredictable guy, and I think about the best we could have hoped for. Well, I certainly don't want to follow up that, Patrick.
All
So
right.
why don't you?
All right.
Why don't you take it away?
Well, I feel like I have a pretty good beer for this episode in that it was an East Coast, West Coast collaboration. So my beer is in the Partnerships series. That's a pun. It's a collaboration between Heavy Seas, which is a Baltimore brewery, and various other breweries. And this one in particular is called the Imperial Brown IPA, and it is a collaboration between Heavy Seas and Stone.
Oh,
And it is ale brewed with blackstrap molasses.
interesting.
So Heavy Seas is very into their pirate theme. And so the blackstrap molasses is kind of on theme there.
I went to their brewery a couple of years ago.
Yeah, how'd you feel about it?
It's very classic, like this is a warehouse, but it's a brewery setup.
Mm.
When I went, it was a couple years ago. They might have moved into a different space by now. And I also don't mind that as a brewery space.
They have a restaurant in downtown
Baltimore,
which I have not been to, but I would like to go. All right, so here it goes. It's definitely brown. Let's see. Yeah, that's pretty good. It's 9% alcohol, and it's a little syrupy, but it's not as bad as a lot of 9% alcohol beers.
Well, Patrick, not to outdo you, not to optimal ideal size you.
But you've got like a 13%.
Just 10.
Okay. All right.
But also from Maryland, actually. We're both going the Maryland route. I'm having a beer called the Higher Ground. You can't win, Patrick. I have the Higher Ground.
Yeah.
This is a barrel-aged American wild ale. This is bottle 254 of 257. So this is the dregs. The last gasps. And this is from Franklin's, which is a little microbrewery gastropub in Hyattsville, Maryland, right near where Julie practices roller derby. So on the evenings where I help her out and pick her up from Metro to drive her to practice, I oftentimes find myself at Franklin's to have a beer and get some reading done, get some work done, hang out. I haven't featured them on the show yet, even though I spent a number of hours there, so I figured it was high past time.
Well, that beer turned out to really be on point, seeing as how we lost Justin when he got to the high ground.
I thought you were going to tie it into our next segment.
Oh, well, that would have been even better of me.
So a location I've geotagged myself at many times, which I guess you don't know, you haven't heard the interview, so I guess it's on me to make that connection. I said it in a way of like maybe you would pick up on it. But
Right. Well, we did mention the name of the next segment earlier, so I kind of get where it's going, if you know what I mean.
So this is actually an interesting situation where I try to line up interviews when I go to meetings, and I don't always, actually, I almost always am not able to talk to everyone I want to talk to, just scheduling, and people don't always stay at the conference the entire time. And so if I miss them by a day, they might already be home or whatever. So in this case, Eloise Marais was already back in the UK at the University of Birmingham, and we were able to connect over Skype to talk about the material she presented at the AGU fall meeting. So I guess this is technically an addendum to my AGU fall meeting coverage, but it was recorded in a more traditional podcast format for our show. So it's a weird kind of hybrid of the two. And what she does, Patrick, and I think you're going to get a kick out of this, is because she uses Google location history to track personal exposure to air pollution. That's the name of her abstract that I'll link to in the show notes.
I mean, that's no finding the Loch Ness Monster, but it's pretty good.
Unless the Loch Ness Monster was susceptible to pollution.
Which I don't see why it wouldn't be.
Right? Well, it's underwater.
That's why there's not many of them around anymore.
That's a good point. Well, let's see what she has to... I don't think I asked her about that, but, we recorded this a little bit ago, so maybe I did, and we're going to listen to that right now.
At sunrise, I fight to stay asleep, 'cause I don't want to leave the comfort of this place. 'Cause there's a hunger, a longing to escape from the life I live when I'm away. So let's go there. Let's make our escape. Come on, let's go there. Let's ask, can we stay? Can you take me higher to a place where the blind man see? Can you take me higher to a place with golden streets?
All right, I'm being joined by Dr. Eloise Marais, who is a Birmingham Fellow at the University of Birmingham School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences, and we are chatting because at AGU this year, you talked about using Google location history to track people's personal exposure to air pollution. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Okay, so this sounds a little Orwellian. Interesting that I'm talking to someone in Britain. So what's going on here with your project?
Yeah, so I was in a conference, so I'll send you through the kind of process that led me to think about using Google location history to try and track personal exposure. I was sitting in a conference looking at someone presenting estimates of the impact of air pollution on human health. And the standard approach is that there'll be this static map of fine particles or PM 2.5 or ozone. And so both of these pollutants are important because they have a negative impact on our health. So fine particles, for example, we breathe deep into the lungs, and they have been shown to lead to premature death.
So this is different than like the pollen that's giving me allergies.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Although, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with what the actual mechanics are behind these fine particles that we breathe in. What we've been able to associate for these health studies is that if the mass concentrations of fine particles in the air increase, there's a negative impact on our health. So it leads to premature death within a population exposed to these high concentrations of fine particles.
So how fine are we talking? Like, could you see these with the naked eye, or?
You could if there's a lot in the atmosphere. So if there's a lot in the atmosphere and they're very reflective, you'll see reduced visibility. So there's actual reflection of sunlight.
Like smog? Would smog be an example?
Smog would certainly include fine particles. Smog is this dirty mix of fine particles and elevated concentrations of ozone. But when we see these sort of pictures of Beijing or Delhi at their worst, we're seeing reduced visibility. So buildings more or less disappear. And this is because we have elevated concentrations of fine particles in the atmosphere scattering sunlight.
And then ozone, just very quickly, because I imagine most people listening to this only think about ozone in the context of the ozone layer of our atmosphere, but ozone's just a gas. Like, it's just an inorganic molecule. It's 3 oxygen atoms bonded together. So the chemical formula would be O3. And it does exist in some amount on the surface of, the terrestrial sphere of Earth, not just up in the atmosphere. So it is a thing that we get exposed to in our daily life, right? Is that...
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we typically think of ozone because, it's received a lot of attention in the stratosphere. So, we've got this ozone hole, this depletion of ozone in the stratosphere, and so more UV radiation reaches the Earth's surface. So this is looking at it in terms of ozone formation near the surface of the Earth, so the air we breathe in opposition to stratospheric ozone. So we tend to say that stratospheric ozone is good for us, and surface ozone is bad for us.
Well, it's sort of like having a clean water supply is good for you, but drowning in water is bad.
That's an interesting analogy. I don't know how perfectly it relates, but yeah, the way to sort of remember it is if you have ozone in the stratosphere, it's really good for us, but if it's formed near the surface, it's really bad for us. It has very high oxidative potential, so we breathe it in and it starts to have really adverse effects on our health.
But what if you eat a lot of antioxidants? Are you good then?
Well, you're going into a world that I am deeply unfamiliar with. I should understand better how the body works, but it's still a mystery to me.
We try our best to avoid talking about health or anything about what people eat. We get more hate mail. If I said like blueberries are bad for you, I'd get more hate mail than if I said, evolution is real and climate change is real. Like, people get very excited to talk about food. So we'll avoid that one and get back to particulates in the atmosphere.
Yeah. And I don't want to offer health advice to avoid exposure to ozone, where I'm definitely not an expert.
There you go. All right. So we're clear on that.
But yeah, breathing in elevated concentrations of ozone has also been shown to have an impact on our health. And it tends to affect people who are more susceptible to exposure to ozone. So the young, the aged, or someone with asthma, say, or some pre-existing condition that might make them more susceptible to adverse health effects.
Okay, so this is your work is especially relevant for at-risk populations.
For ozone exposure. For particles, it doesn't discriminate. It impacts everyone.
Great, finally something that doesn't discriminate.
Yeah, so I've gone on a real tangent, but
no. Yeah. So you came up with, you learned about this issue with particulate matter at a different conference, and then had an idea as a way to track that, I guess.
Yeah, so I was seeing these presentations of these static maps of PM 2.5 or fine particle concentrations and ozone concentrations, and then these would be related to static population maps. And I looked at the map, and I suppose in a moment of narcissism, I thought, well, that's not my exposure. I just relocated from the US to the UK, so I wanted to know, well, what would my exposure be because of this sort of movement pattern that I experienced.
Right. So all the maps you were seeing were static, but people aren't static, people are dynamic. And so you saw a disconnect there.
Yeah, we're living in a very mobile world. We commute to and from work. We migrate. And I'm certainly not the first person to think about this. There are other groups who have looked at what the impact is of mobility on exposure, or how this would impact the current approach to assessing exposure to air pollution. But then the challenge that I faced was, how do I track my movements through the earth over time? And I thought about, well, how do I track my movement through the earth? And I thought of developing a detailed diary that would say where I've been and when and what my location is. And of course, this becomes really complicated because you've got to try and track where you were and when, and no one can remember that. So I looked through my phone and thought, well, Google is constantly tracking where I am because it tells me what the nearest restaurant is that I should try, or how to get from one point to the next as quickly as possible, or traffic updates. And then I explored through my archives and saw that, well, it's recorded my location since, I can't remember, August 2015 or May 2015. I can't remember when it started.
And is this a specific app that is on your phone, or?
It's actually, if you have a Google account, this is my understanding. If you have a Google account, and this information is quite hard to really pin down online, which is surprising considering it's Google. And at least trying to identify how this works is also a bit of a challenge because it's rather diffusely spread across the internet. But as long as you have a Google account and you activate location tracking and storage, you can store this on your archives. So if you had to look at your Google archives, you would see one of the entries is Google location history.
Wow. Okay.
And then you can download that, but in formats that are not really user-friendly if you want to do big data analysis. So it's KML and JSON, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. So then there's some data processing involved to try and get it into a format that's user-friendly.
A KML file, I know it stands for, I just looked this up. I didn't know, but it stands for Keyhole Markup Language, but it's a file that you can open in like Google Earth, right?
Yeah, it's helpful if you want to sort of look at yourself in Google Earth, but if you want to actually have the latitude, longitude, and pressure to try and track where you've been and when, you want it in something like a text file or comma-separated value file. So there's just this additional step of processing, which is fine. It's manageable, but sort of cumbersome if you want to start looking at hundreds of people and how they move through the Earth.
Right. So you wanted to see if the fact that your phone remembered better than you did where you'd been, what that meant for your exposure to these potentially harmful chemicals and particulates.
Yeah. So then, the next step is then, well, now that I know where I've been and when, how do I estimate what my exposure was at those different locations?
Okay.
And so what I have at my disposal is a global chemical transport model. So this calculates, or at least provides you with information about what's being emitted into the atmosphere from, say, natural sources like volcanoes, anthropogenic sources like coal-fired power plants, and also estimates the chemistry pretty dynamically. So it's got a 15-minute time step. So it updates the chemistry every 15 minutes.
Wow.
And spits out a concentration of surface concentrations of fine particles and also surface concentrations of ozone. And so you can actually move each individual through the model and sample their fine particle and ozone concentrations with this geolocation information.
Okay, so you're taking real, actual geolocations from people and putting them in the context of this model, and then building an estimate over time for their exposure.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and you can compare this to what would traditionally be reported in these static exposure estimates. So it would be your postal address. That would be reported.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So instead of just looking at your home and seeing what you'd be exposed to, you're trying to get at a more realistic value by adding in some complexity and some dynamism. And so I guess, was there an increase or a decrease? Like, are we safer staying home or are we safer going out?
So there were a number of challenges in actually pulling off this project. So I anticipated contacting people, getting this really dynamic set of data and running the model and moving hundreds of people through the model and then comparing this postal address versus this mobile.
So you had an idea for like a truly big data.
Yeah.
Really attack the problem. There's a Twitter account I really like called Big Data Batman, and it just replaces any instance of big data with Batman. So it's like, can Batman help the fight against cancer?
Yeah. So in my case, my sort of desire to have Batman solve this question that I had wasn't as successful as I anticipated, because most people actually turn this off.
Most people don't want to be tracked by their phone all the time.
Yeah, which is totally reasonable, because it's sort of in the public consciousness now. There's lots of reports in these sort of tech online magazines about, what is Google doing with this information? How is Google tracking us? Is it passing this information on to other companies? And people are starting to get rather creeped out about sort of infringement on their privacy.
Right.
So I ended up contacting 20 people who I knew would trust me with this very detailed information, and only 6 of them actually had it turned on. So it's a 30% success rate based on my small sample size.
Okay, so it's not that people were unwilling to participate with your study, it's that they had already opted out by turning this feature off before they even knew that it could be useful to you. So people weren't just like saying no to you. They just, okay. Yeah. That's I guess what I'm driving at is like, do you really have friends, or is it people just more private than you anticipated?
Yeah. And I think, that was the biggest issue. And my understanding is that it's not that they turned it off, but you have to actually activate it.
Oh, okay. All right. So it was an opt-in, not an opt-out. All right.
Yeah. And often I don't want to throw Google under the bus here and misrepresent them.
I'm sure they'll take a huge hit if we really slam them right now.
But the impression that I get from the information that's provided online is that you have to first opt in. And I think the way you opt in is not always very clear, because it will say, would you like to store your location? Or would you like to record your location? Or would you like more information about your location? And you would say yes or no. Or, certain apps will ask if you can provide your location. I'm paraphrasing, but you've seen this with an app that you need to know where you are in order for the app to work best, like a weather app, for example. Mm-hmm. And so you can activate this feature just by saying yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So not many people want to activate this. So the success rate was low from that point of view.
I never activate those things just because I don't want to drain my battery life.
Yeah. So it's somewhat clever at preventing too much battery loss, because it chooses how to record location based on the least use of battery. So like a GPS location would be battery intensive. And so most of them would take location information from Wi-Fi networks or cell tower networks.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily accuracy that wins. It's reduced sort of drainage on the battery.
Gotcha.
So I mean, I have it turned on and I don't find that it drains my battery. Other silly features like apps that drain your battery tend to be more of an issue.
When I'm out hunting Pokemons, I'm using my location anyway. So
So I wanted a perfect study where I was going to get 100 people or more than 100 people, sample them through this model, and then say something very conclusive about mobility versus the static exposure estimate. And it turns out that I was informed more through the study of the limitations of using Google location history than I was of the sort of ultimate goal of my project. So like data collection frequency was highly variable from one volunteer to the next, which meant that a person that has much higher location collection frequency would be sort of biased, or at least, let me rephrase, large variability in data collection frequency would lead to large biases and sort of inconsistencies across volunteers that might travel within the same location, for example.
Gotcha.
Or the other challenges. Oh, and then spurious locations show up. If someone tries to sort of hack into your Google account in Poland, you have a spurious location in Poland, which sort of showed up in my location history.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so someone was trying to break into your account.
Yeah, I assume. I mean, it seems too distant for me to really have
So you had to look for outliers.
Yeah.
Yeah, because and I also know, like, I don't do this on my phone, but like I have used VPNs before.
Yeah.
I found out that when I was living abroad, that if I logged into my university's VPN to like get PDFs from the library, it also made Netflix work again. So it looked like I was coming from a different place.
Yeah, and I think that's another issue with using multiple devices too, or at least if your Google account is synced over multiple devices and multiple people use that same device, that can also show up. Or someone moves with their Wi-Fi router to another location, but their Wi-Fi router is still recorded in their previous location. That shows up as well, because you'll pass a home with a Wi-Fi router and there's a location associated with that Wi-Fi router, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
So there were some fun little like deviations from sort of travel routes that showed up, but those are removable because they show up as really unrealistically fast travel times.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so then once you came up with a data set that you were happy with, because you'd kind of scrubbed it clean or removed the stuff that didn't make sense, then you were, even though you had less data than you were hoping to work with, were you then able to plug it into this more dynamic, updated every 15-minute model and find something?
Yeah, so I did find some interesting patterns that I don't think were necessarily unusual or sort of groundbreaking, but they revealed some interesting patterns about our movement through the Earth. So, for example, the Google location history that I used for the two people that relocated from the US to the UK, it turns out that relocation had a detrimental effect on their health.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So the UK is experiencing really poor air quality at the moment, largely associated with proliferation of diesel vehicles and traffic congestion. So the UK largely adopted a diesel vehicle fleet to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So to tackle climate, but then led to an air pollution catastrophe.
All I can hear is Jeremy Clarkson in my head saying, "A Volkswagen Astra Diesel."
That's not too bad a rendition of Jeremy Clarkson.
Yeah, I've watched a lot of Top Gear.
Okay.
It had the worst particulate matter in the world.
So that's one sort of travel pattern that showed up as a clear increase in pollution, or at least increase in exposure to pollution, I'm sorry. There was some other interesting patterns. So there was one volunteer who traveled to Boulder, Colorado when there were wildfire outbreaks in the Northwest Pacific. And this was unprecedented wildfires, and the degradation in air quality reached as far south as Boulder. And so we can look at things like what happens when you're exposed to an air pollution episode. And, this really does represent a clear example of an air pollution episode. One that's actually, again, in the public consciousness, the US is concerned with the contribution of wildfires to air pollution as other contributors are decreasing, like industry and cars. And
well, I know, every once in a while I'll see a study that comes out that talks about how, airborne or windblown dust from Africa, the Sahara, does reach the east coast of the United States. Is that sort of this same system that we're talking about, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, that would represent an episode, something that doesn't happen routinely, like coal-fired power plants.
So the coal-fired power plants are a constant output in a certain location, and then every once in a while you have these big events that move things around the world in larger, more unexpected ways. And that's maybe why it's important to have a dynamic view of the system, because that way you're accounting for these rare events and how people move within them.
I would hope that in an annual average map of fine particles, there would be some representation of these episodes if they occur frequently enough to actually make a contribution, or if they're enhanced enough to make a contribution to the annual mean. But in this case, it's an example of someone who actually traveled to a location that experienced a pollution episode and then goes back home.
It's also I wouldn't immediately anticipate somebody going to Boulder, Colorado to be at an increased risk of exposure for a wildfire happening in a different state.
Yeah.
That's a cool result too.
Yeah. It was, well-timed without intentionally being well-timed. But I was able to evaluate, what did this do to the exposure of this individual versus another individual who stayed at their residential address. So a few of these volunteers were actually couples living together. So you could look at, what happens when one couple leaves and experiences this pollution episode relative to the other couple who stayed at their residential address. So the sort of control in this experiment.
Oh, that's cool. Kind of like when they send one twin to space.
Yeah, exactly. Which happened recently, right?
I believe so, yes. Yeah. We should try to get one of them on the show, but not the other as a control.
Or remotely on the show. I don't know.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. I don't know if their internet connection is fast enough. It might be these days.
You'd have a slight delay.
It'd be the first time we had light delay as a factor on our show. That would be good. Okay, so you had all these challenges, but you also had some cool benefits from people living together and stuff. And so did you find that, what did you find? Did you find that your model was a better predictor of actual risk or yeah?
Yeah, so I should say that the intention was certainly not for the model to represent perfectly the estimates of surface concentrations of fine particles and ozone, but to provide me with a way to evaluate the difference between a residential address exposure or a static exposure and a mobile exposure, so someone moving through the globe. So the reason I used this specific model is because it provides me with a very dynamic chemistry. So there's a lot of variability, or lot of temporal variability in the concentration of the pollutants, and also it's global. So I have one volunteer who traveled all the way to China, so I could evaluate what that did to that person's exposure. Another approach would have been to use actual measurements of these pollutants, but these are very, very sparse. So I wouldn't be able to sample them coincident with all of my volunteers. So, for example, some of the volunteers traveled to South Africa and there's little to no surface observations there. So this model fills those gaps very nicely.
Okay, so Charlie and I, one of my other co-hosts, and I talked about climate models for like a half hour on a couple of episodes ago. And then somebody wrote in with a much more succinct summary that does not take a half hour to say, basically their point was, you could just say that models aren't perfect, but they're useful.
Yeah, and that's a totally reasonable summary.
I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly who sent that in, but good job, you.
Credit you.
Yes.
Yeah, and in this case, it's not a climate model, but what's called an atmospheric chemistry model or a chemical transport model. And so the difference here is that it's doing very detailed chemistry of the atmosphere, where things like fine particles and ozone are formed from a sequence of reactions that take place in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
A climate model might simplify the atmospheric chemistry far more than a chemical transport model. And also a chemical transport model, at least in this case, is run with what's called assimilated meteorology. So it uses a lot of observations to obtain the meteorology that's needed to drive the model, like winds and temperature and solar insolation.
Yeah, meteorology way more fine scale complicated than something like climate.
Yes, yeah, totally. It's at a very, very short time resolution.
Right. Another one of my co-hosts, Jacob, once used the analogy that like predicting climate or understanding climate is like understanding the range of where water droplets hit when they're put out of a fountain, versus weather on any particular day is like trying to predict the trajectory of a single drop. Where is that one drop going to hit?
Yeah, and I suppose Neil deGrasse Tyson does a good...
Who? No, I'm just kidding.
Did I pronounce his name wrong?
Former guest of the show, Neil deGrasse Tyson.
I don't know if he did a YouTube video of this or just sort of demonstrated it verbally, but it was him walking along the beach and a dog sort of oscillating as he walked directly. Yeah. And so the oscillations, I think he said, represented the weather, and him moving sort of directly represented climate, to try and sort of explain
the
difference between weather and climate. Yeah. He does a far more succinct description than I am providing, but it's a good analogy.
But so the point is you've got a model that can fill in the gaps where there's no real data to use.
Yeah, and this could certainly be taken in many other directions, to use observations instead. But we really wanted to see, can this detailed geolocation information be used in the future?
And what'd you find?
Yeah, so we did find some interesting ways in which this geolocation information can be used. And one is to attempt to address issues of pollution exposure for indoor air quality. So what I've been talking about mostly is using a model that gives you information about outdoor air quality, or ambient air quality is another way of describing it. But indoor air pollution exposure is still a large source of uncertainty. So we attempted to demonstrate that we can use this geolocation information by looking at the exposure of 2 volunteers to air pollution in an underground tunnel in London, where there are already measurements of fine particles in this underground tunnel that are sort of an order of magnitude higher than you would be exposed to in ambient air.
Really? So when you're riding the tube, there's like a bunch of particulates in the air.
Yeah, and the main reason seems absurd, considering that there is an easy solution. It's just that the windows are open, so the particles from the tunnel enter the train.
Okay.
And so we looked at, well, when are these 2 volunteers on this single underground line? And so we replaced the model's estimate of particles with these measurements that are available and reported in the literature. And we looked at, well, what does this do to their health risk? And it turns out it's only 10 to 12 minutes of their sort of daily exposure, but it contributes a substantial amount to their sort of annual average exposure to fine particles. So it's a substantial source of sort of exposure to pollution, even though it only represents 10 to 12 minutes of their day.
Wow, that's okay.
Under ideal conditions, because the 2 volunteers that I sampled would tell you that it doesn't always run that well.
Right. Yeah. 10 to 12 minutes is a pretty short commute, at least by my DC standards, if it holds true in DC metro system.
Yeah. And it's only 2 stops that they're on this line. So
it's not going to Heathrow.
No.
That is a long ride.
Yes. Yeah. It takes a long time.
So it sounds like you, by adding in the sort of dynamic approach and the Google location history, you're showing that people are actually exposed to more ozone and fine particle mass than would be predicted if we just used like where their house is.
Yeah, so the opposite also occurred. So there was someone who travels extensively to South America and Central America, very much coastal sites.
Okay.
And their exposure actually decreased when you took into account their mobility versus their postal address. So the opposite was also the case. And I can't say conclusively that the two cancel out, so there's no effect of mobility on health, because I don't have a large enough data set or sample size.
Right. So is that something you're thinking about for the future, or what's kind of, I mean, so it sounds like basically you've convinced me that you get a finer resolution on a person's actual exposure when you use their Google location history. Was that kind of your feeling as well?
What do you mean by finer? Like, as in you get to know more intricate details about when and where people are exposed?
Yeah. It just seems like, it's just a more comprehensive view of a person's exposure when you account for their actual movement in the globe.
Yeah, you can start to look at exactly what a trip to China does to your personal exposure, or frequent commute patterns does to your exposure. So I think it was not a conclusive study in terms of what mobility does to personal exposure, but it was a study to demonstrate that there's a lot of potential in using this. So I'm hoping that going forward, we can find a contact at Google who would be willing to work with us on this project.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
To try and actually mine a much larger data set to look at specific mobility patterns. I thought the commuter pattern was really interesting. So you could look at a whole population of individuals who live on the outskirts of London, for example, and commute to and from central London for work, or any other city. I mean, there's so many that could be sampled.
Right. But that's really cool. Okay. So that's kind of what you're actively pursuing. Because I was going to ask you at one point, like, are you looking for more volunteers? But it sounds like you're trying to go a different route with it and not just be asking the individual to participate, but see if you can get the institution to help out.
Yeah, that would certainly be one potential option, or to conduct a more targeted cohort study. So, instead of my approach, which is looking backwards on, finding people who had already stored a reasonable amount of this data on their phones, would be to instead actually identify a cohort of individuals who would then use this Google location archive going forward. Then it could be a year-long or 2-year-long study, and we could couple that with measurements of air pollutants. We could also use things like Fitbits that record your activity to look at what different activity patterns does to your actual dose of air pollution, because then you could actually look at how frequently people are breathing in, or at what frequency people are breathing in air pollutants.
I can already see the poorly researched local news headline, like, is exercise making you less healthy?
Yeah.
A new study shows that when you breathe more because you're running, you actually are going to die tomorrow or at 11.
Yeah. So sit still, put on weight, eat red meat.
No.
All right. Yeah. This is always the danger with looking at something that's rather trendy and catches the public's eye. You don't want the wrong message.
Yeah, it's tricky doing anything that has any connection to human health, essentially.
Yeah, it is, because it can either be misinterpreted or, I suppose it can be misinterpreted. There's no either.
And most likely will be misinterpreted.
Yeah.
But it sounds like this has a lot of potential, which is really cool.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm an early career scientist who needs to look for funding, so anything with potential is always exciting.
Very cool.
And helping.
Yeah. And so we will link to the abstract for the talk you gave at AGU in the show notes, because those are all publicly accessible. But do you have any other outreach avenues that people can go check out online, or any sort of social media presence?
Oh, I am embarrassingly not very social media present. I have a website.
Okay, yeah, we can plug the website.
For my research group. I don't know can I type into the chat bar?
You can, but I have it up right now because I tried to
perfect.
to
Go
a little above and beyond here. It's marairesearchgroup.co.uk.
Yes, that's correct.
And that has some links to other projects you've worked on, as well as publications, presentations, and just some general info. So if people are curious about the work, they can go check that out. And is there anything else you feel like we needed to cover with this particular project, or have we done it?
I can't think of anything else that came out of this. I'm just scrolling through my presentation now. I should mention that this wasn't done in isolation. So I have a co-author, Christine Wiedenmeyer, who's also involved in the project.
Right, and she's with Ceres, which is out of Boulder, Colorado, and that's how you and I got connected. We weren't able to connect at AGU meeting proper, but we're able to chat now because Katie is just on top of it and great.
Yeah, she was super organized, which was awesome.
Yeah, she makes the job easy for sure. So very cool. Well, thank you so much for giving us some of your time to chat about this. And I think it was really interesting. This is totally unlike anything we've ever talked about on the show before. So it's kind of a whole new way of thinking about a cool question and a cool way to answer it. So thank you very much for telling us about it.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh boy, what'd you think about that, Patrick? That interview.
Yeah, I like where she was going.
Do you feel like you're more or less susceptible to pollution now?
Is alcohol considered pollution?
It's not in this. It's self-inflicted. There's no like secondhand alcohol like there is secondhand smoke. And we have yet to branch out into a what are you smoking segment. Seems a bad idea.
Yeah.
But we have branched out into a what are our listeners telling us about secondhand listenerships, I guess. I don't know what you would call it. But we cover those things in our final segment of the show, and that segment is called the PaleoPOW.
Riding along in my automobile, my baby beside me at the wheel. I stole a kiss at the turn of a mile, my curiosity running wild, cruising and playing the radio with no particular place to go. Riding along in my automobile, I was anxious to tell her the way I feel. So I told her softly and sincere, and she leaned and whispered in my ear, cuddling more and driving slow, with no particular place to go.
Hey, Patrick.
Yes, Ryan.
The listeners, man, they're out there.
I know. They're there. Listening.
Some of them are even patrons.
Those are my favorite listeners.
Because they went to patreon.com and signed up to give us a little bit of money every month to make this show happen. Somebody has to pay Justin's phone bill.
Somebody has to pay for all this open access.
Right. And that's not us, because we're going to take this money for ourselves to keep doing the show, and Justin can handle that on his own. But we got a patron in Jeff C.
We did. Jeff C., good on you.
Yeah, and that means he gets a thesis based on the topics for this episode. But sometimes when a patron and a podcast love each other very much, Patrick, the patron will send the podcast a message, and we can use that message to then get a little bit more information about how to incorporate a thesis for this person.
Got it.
So Jeff C. writes in and says, hey, y'all, it's trailer. No, I'm fairly new to the PaleoPOWs. I've been listening to your podcast for a few months now, and I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm listening to the back catalog to get caught up. You keep me entertained for hours while I'm at work. I work as a horticulturalist for a museum where I study pollination strategies and grow threatened and endangered plants for ex situ conservation. So I spend most of my days alone in a greenhouse. This is a good thing.
This is amazing.
Yeah, I know, right? I love that you present your expertise in your respective fields so eloquently and in ways that even the layperson can understand, while still keeping those of us who speak the language of science engaged. I feel like I'm hanging out with my sciencey friends, talking about sciencey stuff all day. I, for a time, wanted to be a paleontologist.
Yeah, you did.
This is the dark turn, Patrick. This is where it gets real. I put this in the Slack so you could read it ahead of time, and if you didn't, it's on you. I perused it as an undergrad through a geology degree with plans to go to grad school after, but was completely turned off by the amount of sexism and homophobia I experienced from peers, professors, and the geology field in general. Maybe this was just a product of my going to school in Houston, Texas, where the oil is the backbone of the economy, and it's the only thing that matters. I was fascinated by the science behind it all, but I felt like I was being trained to go into the oil and gas industry because that's where the money is. Perhaps if I had been in a different state, things would have turned out differently. Instead, I shifted to biology and ecology. Now as an adult, I work in that world and couldn't be happier. Please accept my recurring donations so you can keep fighting the good fight and continue to present your science to the masses. Thanks, Jeff. P.S. I'm drinking iced coffee because I need it to live, and it's always hot in the greenhouses. Sort of. I love iced coffee.
Yeah. I mean, I like hot coffee too. I have no problem with either temperature of coffee.
I definitely drink more hot coffee, but when the time is right for iced coffee, It's amazing. But yeah, so Patrick,
Yes.
tried to be a geologist.
Yeah, I did.
Well, so did Jeff.
Jeff tried to be a geologist and a paleontologist.
Well, it's interesting that like I started off in biology and then shifted into like geology, paleontology, and
I was the same way. Yeah.
Yeah.
He went the other way.
He did. We were both straight white men, so I think some of the sexism and homophobia wouldn't have been directed at us. But I think more and more we're learning that it's a problem in the natural sciences, especially in field sciences. And so, Jeff, that sucks. And really sorry that happened to you. And really sorry that exists in our field. I've been in departments that are very academic focused. I've been in departments that are very industry focused in terms of geology. And, the cultures are definitely different. And I don't think that either one is perfect when it comes to issues of sexism. And it's just, I don't know, man. This is like, we're talking about this in sort of the midst of the Me Too reckoning of the world, and I don't think academia is exempt from that. So
certainly not.
It's important, I think, for people just to say that, hey, this happened to me. I mean, that's the whole point of Me Too, right? And so thanks for writing in and letting us know that you had this experience. It's really awesome that you found your place in the world, which happens to be in a greenhouse, but it sucks that there was some hardship to get there.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I think you wind up in places that you're glad you got to, but it would have been nice to have felt like you had all the options available to you.
It's also just tough to be in a department where if you're a person who wants to pursue the more academic side of things, to not really feel like you have that option. And vice versa, right? It would be frustrating if you wanted to get into earth sciences because you recognize the economic potential, but weren't offered that opportunity. So it's just...
And that could be really, earth sciences is a weird cross section of those things, right? Because you get people who are ultra concerned about the environment and wanting to preserve and conserve everything that the earth, all the earth's natural resources. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who want to exploit those natural resources.
Yeah, Charlie.
For example.
Yeah, no, that's true. And from an economic perspective, earth sciences up there with like chemical engineering has some of the best job placement ratings if that's the path you choose to go on. But it's just one of many paths within the earth sciences as a career. And, I would say biology and ecology, unless you're going to like biomed, definitely don't have the industry facing side of things.
Med school. Well, I don't know. So, I mean, yes, it's definitely like a biotech or biomed.
Yeah.
World.
But I like a greenhouse.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely did not appreciate plants enough when I was younger.
Still don't
appreciate them much. I'm coming around to them.
I don't.
All right. Well, we got a thesis title to come up with.
We do. I'm thinking, can we somehow, Jeff, maybe modeling pollution exposure in greenhouses as a function of allometric constraints? Something like that.
How about cold house techniques for growing? Oh, what is the genus and species of coffee? It's going to be arabica, robusto, or no. That's the species epithet. I don't know what the coffee. Let me see.
No, this is good. I like where you're going with it. Coffea
arabica.
Well, yeah.
Coffea arabica. Okay, so like cold house techniques for a hybrid species of iced coffee.
Cold beans for hot coffee. Yeah. Hot beans for cold coffee.
Yeah, that's the episode that we title when we interview him about his thesis.
Well, no, I like to do the sciencey sounding thing colon the non-sciencey sounding thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
So,
all right.
So hothouse techniques to develop ideal allometric size constrained Coffea arabica beans, pollution resistant. Right?
Yeah.
Pollution resistant Coffea arabica beans, hot houses for cold beans.
Or Coffea arabica, a cleanser.
Drano for the human body. I think we got it.
Okay, yeah. All right.
Sweet.
Congratulations on your master's in...
I don't know that we've ever said it's a master's. I think we just say it's a degree in science sort of ing.
Okay.
The nebulous title. It's probably like an associate's
I'm rusty.
degree.
I haven't been on in a while. I don't know how all this works exactly.
It's called an associate's degree.
Okay. It's more a certificate program.
No, but I mean, it's like, it's a, there's coursework masters and then thesis masters. This is a thesis associate's degree.
Okay. Fair enough. I'm ready. But, put that on your resume.
People should.
Yeah. It's a thing.
More than welcome to. I mean, do people read CVs?
Resumes? I don't know.
Mine's pretty long. Not because, it's just long because I include everything, which I probably shouldn't at this point.
Mm-hmm. Titles.
It's all just about the podcast. I just list every episode.
Right.
A terrible strategy. What do you got for us, Patrick?
Okay. All right. My turn. Here we go. So I have an email from Cliff E. That's a Cliff.
Cliffy.
Cliff E. Yes, not Cliffy.
Hi, it looks like you're working on a podcast. Can I help you with that? That's a Clippy joke.
Ah, gotcha.
Never mind. Cut it, Tim.
I like how we're making Tim edit this one. So this message, it's actually to you, Ryan.
Sometimes messages come to me.
Yeah. He says, hey, Ryan. Well, okay. Weird title of this is Weird Animal Stuff. Hey, Ryan. Just finished listening to episode 215. Good enough for now. I enjoyed the interview with Mara of the WTF Evolution Tumblr blog and book. Well, I especially enjoyed the second segment of the interview talking about weird animals. Thanks for introducing this informative and amusing blog/book to those of us who have been living in caves for the past several years. It reminded me of another podcast I heard very recently, an NPR Science and Health short. It was from March 6th, entitled Quokka? Quokka?
It's a marsupial. Quokka.
Really?
Say it with an Australian accent. I'll come out fine.
Could a quokka beat a numbat?
Aces, mate. Do they say aces in Australia? I don't know. It felt right in the moment.
Could a quokka beat a numbat? I put heaps of dollars on the quokka. And he gives a link here to an NPR.org article called "Could a Quokka Beat a Numbat?" Odds makers say yes. It's about evolutionary biologists who have put together a Mammal March Madness bracket and run the odds on the outcome of hypothetical fights between various mammals. It looks both amusing and informative. Also, and I thought one of the biologists might make a great interview for a future show. You've likely already seen this or had others recommend it, but I put my vote in for it as a segment now too. Keep up the good work with the podcast and other stuff you're doing, Cliff. Thanks, Cliff. Checked out that article on NPR. It looks pretty awesome.
Were you familiar with this? Were you not familiar with the March Mammal bracket?
Well, I wasn't familiar with the quokka, basically. But from at least last year or the last couple of years, I remember seeing the March Madness mammal bracket, and it's popular in Twitter with the people I follow.
Yeah, I follow a lot of those people too. And Jacqueline Gill and I, for a while, were talking about doing something like this, and we could never quite get our act together. And so I'm glad somebody did. And the effort is mostly run by Professor Katie Hinde. I think that's how you say her last name. Hinde. She is a professor at Arizona State University, and she has maybe my favorite Twitter handle on the internet. And that Twitter handle is Mammals Suck. She studies mother's milk and infant development.
Well, that's a mammal.
But it's sucking the milk.
Got it.
That's why I love it. Because it's like, you think you're going one way with it. You thought she was going one way with it.
Yep.
And then it went another way.
Yeah.
All about why milk's so great. Do you like milk? Are you lactose intolerant?
I think more than I used to be, that's how it goes, right?
Yep.
But it seems to be with the even up to whole, even half and half is fine. You put heavy cream in some kind of dish, and you probably won't see a lot of me after dinner.
All right. Well, this email from Cliff is a few years old, I'll admit, but they still are doing the March Mammal Madness, and this episode should be coming out in March. And so I wanted to bring it up to people because it looks like, as far as I can tell, there is a March Mammal Madness page on Facebook and a website, and you can follow Katie on Twitter. And it looks like they're gearing up for 2018. So they kind of do a different theme every year. And so I don't know that they've announced what this year's theme is, but by the time this episode comes out, they most certainly will have. And so go check it out and get involved if this is the kind of thing that sounds like a fun time for you and yours. If you don't like basketball.
Well, I mean, it's just, I think you fill out a bracket.
I mean, even if you do like basketball, I guess.
Yeah. You like sports.
Well, there's 2 baskets on the court. So it's baskets ball. There's 1 ball. Baskets, right?
Well, I don't know. There's many feet. So it's also feet ball.
No, it's soccer.
Well, American feet ball.
No, I mean, you make a compelling argument.
I mean, I feel like we could do this with lots of
We sure could, but I think the joke would have diminishing returns. Especially since it's a joke I stole from one Judge John Hodgman. So, the end. Thanks for writing in, Cliff.
Yeah, Cliff, thanks.
I really want to leave that dead space in there when I edit it. I probably won't. How you doing, Patrick?
Yeah, this 9% stuff, that's no joke. I don't know how you're doing over the 10%.
I'm doing great, man. I definitely haven't reached my starvation state yet.
That was good paper. I don't care what you say.
Whoa, hang on. Don't throw me under the bus like that. I thought it was a great paper.
Oh, are we still recording?
Yes, we're still recording. We haven't done any of I gotta do the final outro stuff. When I said how you doing, that was me offering you the opportunity to talk about what you got going on. How you doing, Patrick?
I'm doing great, Ryan. Let's see, what do I have going on?
You're bailing on your class, so I'm gonna have to come take over again.
That's right. Yeah, so I might be on again before the class is over, but teaching another geochemistry class at George Mason University. Shout out to all my patriots. And they are, I'm not even sure that's the right mascot, Ryan.
You don't know what the mascot for your own school is?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. Let me check that out. Anyway, for their final project, they're going to be producing a series of podcasts. They did this 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there's a few podcasts up about geochemistry already, and I will. Yeah, Ryan. I wasn't quite ready for this.
You weren't quite ready to promote the projects you're working on, as I ask literally everyone who comes on the show about?
Well, I don't really consider myself as coming on the show right now. I'm not.
It's only because you don't come on the show that often, but
right. Yeah. They're the Patriots. Well, the Patriot.
That was my high school mascot.
Really?
Yep. Pat R. Riot.
Nice. Gunston is our mascot. He's a Patriot. Well, yeah. It used to be Gunston. So George Mason's house is called Gunston Hall. So their mascot used to be called Gunston, and he was like a furry, like crocodile-looking thing. Now he's merged with a Patriot-looking mascot with a tri-corner hat, and so he's like a green and gold dude in a tri. Is that right? Tri-corner hat.
Yeah, it's got 3.
Yeah, and so now the Patriot and Gunston are one. Interesting. All right. So that settles that. Now let me see if I can. So from my geochemistry class at George Mason, they are producing podcast episodes about geochemistry. So there's a set of these from a year ago that you can find on Soundcloud.com. If you search GMU geochemistry, they'll pop right up. And there's going to be another series of those produced this year by my class. So go listen to those from 2 years ago and keep an eye on the internet for the new series coming out probably towards the end of May.
Nice.
And I still want to do one on kind of on the periodic table, kind of on just like nuclear chemistry. Brian, that dream won't die.
Nor should it.
We're going to produce this high production value podcast about nuclear chemistry in the periodic table.
It's one of our patron goals.
Yeah.
You're dropping some serious hints about the super secret project.
Okay.
It's good though.
Sorry.
No, wet the
How close are we to the super secret project?
We're going to get to t-shirts and coasters first, and then super secret project time.
All right. Got it.
Now you ask me what I have going on.
Ryan, do you have any pets?
No, I don't. I just have a series of dogs coming through my apartment at seemingly random intervals. You've met one of them.
Yeah.
He's a
Oreo.
delight. Oh, the best. Oreo. Yes, Oreo is one of the better dogs that exist, but they're all good dogs, Bront. But that's not actually what I have to plug. I have to plug a couple things, actually.
I'm surprised I get that.
You listen to Reply All.
I mean, other than this podcast, that's the best podcast there is.
But they are good dogs, Bront. That is one of the best jokes that's ever been on the internet.
Oh.
But speaking of other podcasts, I'm a frequent guest on the iFanboy Pick of the Week podcast, as well as some of their special edition podcasts. Most recently, the special edition podcast for a little film. It's an indie flick. You probably haven't heard of it. It's called Black Panther.
Yeah. Who makes that?
It's a little studio. They only put out a couple movies a year. Marvel.
Oh, Marvel, yeah.
Marvel, yeah. So the Marvel Studios put out this movie, Black Panther, and it's awesome. It's so good. It is a gush fest in that episode of the show, but go check it out if that's what people are into. And then something Patrick technically knows about that I'm about to plug, but probably forgot about when he read the email and didn't reply to me about it. I will be giving a talk at the Soaring Ridge Brewery in Roanoke, Virginia.
That's going to be awesome. What are you going to talk about?
I haven't decided yet. Josh, who lives outside Roanoke, called in and told me about this, but it was before I was living in this region, and I was going through some of the old voicemails to see if we had any we hadn't used before, and I saw this voicemail, and I was like, oh yeah, how far away can Roanoke be? And so I got in touch, and it's the lecture series is run by the
5
Science...
hours.
You know me, I'm a crazy person. The talk series at Soaring Ridge Brewery is run by the Science Museum of Western Virginia, so I got in touch with them, and I'm going to go down there and give a talk. So my talk is going to be on April 11th, and I'll continue to plug it probably as I figure out what some of the details are. And so, Josh, if you're, I swear, if you are not there...
Oh, Josh, don't stay home. I don't want to see you drug out of your bed at night.
Come on. So I'm really excited about that. Obviously, I've not been to Roanoke, even though I grew up only a couple hours away. Excited to go check out the town, check out the museum, check out the brewery, and give a talk about science. So come say hi if you're in the area.
Well, if I were in the area, I would definitely go. Right.
Yeah, I know it's a real slog to get from northern to western Virginia.
It's a long way down I-81.
Anyway, well, thanks for joining me, Patrick.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
And thanks to the Yeti, wherever he may be in the hills outside Gilroy, California.
Terrorizing motorists on Pacheco Pass.
I enjoyed chatting with him, even though we lost some of that interview in terms of what you, the listener, will be able to hear. I think you probably got enough to be excited about the work he's doing. And it was cool to talk to Eloise about tracking people using their phones for good this time, for a change. And I think that's about all we have this week. So with that, we're going to wrap it up, and thank you all for listening. We'll be sure to see you next time for a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
And I got Yeti to send in one, too.
Oh, nice.
He'll be in there.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey.
Well, thank God this isn't a live show.
Oh, no, we're streaming this.
How would that work?
Have you guys ever done a live show?
Yeah, but not from your car.
No. Hey, what episode number is this?
279.
That's amazing. What was the last one I was on? Like 15?
You've been back on since then for a special guest spot.
Yeah, maybe. Is that right?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
We know.
What was it about? The Egypt thing?
You were on in 172. You talked to us about like network dynamics or something.
Yeah. Sounds boring.
Almost 100 episodes ago.
Wow.
I think.
Yeah, about right.
Unless our search function isn't working properly.
Right.